Hey friends, there's nothing better than fresh tomatoes straight from the garden. The ones from the grocery store just don't compare. We've been blessed with a ton of tomatoes this year, more than we can eat before they go bad, because tomatoes only last about a week. Luckily, we know how to pressure can tomatoes, so we can enjoy this harvest all year long. In this video, I'll show you how to do it too. So, let's dig in. Tomatoes are one of the most versatile vegetables in the garden. In addition to salads and fresh tomatoes, tomato sandwiches and such like that, tomatoes are great cooked in soups and sauces, and there's nothing more delicious and satisfying than your own spaghetti sauce made from tomatoes you grew right there in your own backyard. And with your own stock of canned tomatoes, you can make those sauces and soups and other cooked tomato dishes from your garden tomatoes all year long. So let's learn how to pressure can tomatoes. You'll need some special equipment to can tomatoes. You'll need a pressure canner. There are a lot of canners on the market to choose from, but I use a Presto 16-quart canner. The directions in this video are specific to the Presto 16-quart canner. Consult the instruction manual for your specific canner to make sure you can your tomatoes safely. Now this canner says it's a 16-quart canner, and that's confusing because it'll only can 7 quart-sized jars or 9 pint-sized jars. The 16-quart name, I guess, is because it will hold 16 quarts of water. Whatever. It will only can 7 quart-sized jars or 9 pint-sized jars. I bought my Presto pressure canner on sale for around $100 2 years ago, but it's currently listed at about $112. I've definitely gotten my money's worth out of this canner over the last 2 years. I've canned a lot of stuff from my garden. My main critique of the Presto canner is that it only comes with a 15 psi pressure regulator weight, but most canning recipes call for 11 psi. And this will make sure that the canner does not go above 15 psi, but I want something that makes the canner where it won't go above 11 psi, because almost all the recipes that are out there for my area and my sea level are for 11 psi. Now it has a pressure gauge on the top of the canner, so you're supposed to be able to dial in the pressure by increasing or reducing the heat on your stove. But I've found that it is nearly impossible to get exactly 11 psi just by regulating the heat on my stove. So I bought a adjustable pressure regulator weight. This pressure regulator weight has 3 weights on it, so you can configure it. This is 5 psi. If you add a second weight, that's 10 psi, and then you can put a third weight on there to make it 15 psi, which is exactly what this is. So all I have to do is run it with the weight like this, and that's 10 psi, and that will keep the canner perfectly regulated at 11 psi. It won't go above that, because this pressure regulator begins to wobble on top of the lid of the canner, allowing steam to escape, and so it keeps it from going above 11 psi. So in my opinion, this is an essential piece of equipment that you're going to need for your Presto canner. You should definitely have one if you use this canner. I'll leave a link in the description for this weight. The weight that I bought is adjustable, like I said, between 5, 10, and 15 psi. But so far, I only ever have to use it in the 10 psi configuration, and it was about $15. I bought a canning accessory pack for $17.99 that includes several items. Some I would say are more useful than others. The funnel is very useful if it funnels boiling water into jars and helps keep water and salt off of the rim and any kind of food from getting on the rim of the jar so that it can make a good seal. And it works really well for things like tomatoes and beans. A jar lifter is optional, but it is a very useful tool to have. See, you're dealing with very hot jars, and this works excellently for lifting the jars out of the boiling water. A magnetic lid lifter is excellent for lifting metal lids out of boiling water when you're sterilizing them. A bubble popper is useful for popping bubbles down in the jar so that you can work out all of the air and get your headspace right. But you could use something like a butter knife or the handle of a spoon as well to get down in there and do it. So it's not absolutely necessary. A jar wrench helps grip hot jars so that you can hold the jar and tighten the metal rings around it. But you could also use a pot holder or a thick kitchen towel. Of course, tongs are always helpful. A lot of people have these in their kitchen anyway. You're going to need canning jars, lids, and rings. Now, it's important to know you can reuse jars and you can reuse metal rings, but you can't reuse lids. You have to use a brand new lid every time you can. Reusing lids won't give you a good seal, and the seal is the whole deal. Also, I didn't have a good experience with off-brand lids. They seem to have a higher failure rate, as much as 1 to 2 jars per batch, and that's just depressing when you go through all the work and then you lose, 2 jars in your batch. Just stick with the name brand lids. I use Ball or Kerr. You also want to inspect your jars each time you use them. Any cracks or nicks, especially in the rim of the jar, mean that it won't seal properly. So make sure your jars are all in good shape. You'll find out that in this video, I actually got almost to the point of putting my jars in the canner, and I realized that one of the rims on the jar had a nick in it. So I had to change it out. I prefer to use wide mouth jars for tomatoes, but you can use regular mouth jars too. It just makes it a little harder to get the tomatoes out of the jar. I didn't have any wide mouth jars. I need to get some more, so I just use regular mouth jars in this video, and it works fine. I prefer to can tomatoes in quart-sized jars. That's the right amount for me when I go to cook them later, but you can use pint jars if you want a smaller serving size. You're also going to need some non-iodized salt. It's best not to use iodized salt because it may darken or cause discoloration in the canning process. Canning salt is the best option as it's made specifically for canning and it doesn't have any other additives that would mess up the process or cause discoloration. You're going to need some lemon juice, 14 tablespoons to can 7 quart-sized jars, and some white distilled vinegar to help wipe off and clean the rims of your jars. You also want to do a little prep work before you get started canning. Make sure everything is clean. Your counters are clean, your jars are clean, and your lids, and all of your equipment that you're using. It's not necessary to sterilize your jars and your lids because they're going to be sterilized during the canning process, but make sure that they're clean. You want to put down a kitchen towel on the kitchen counter or the table where you're going to be collecting your jars. This is where we're going to put the hot jars, and you don't want hot jars setting directly on cold counters or cold surface because they could shatter. This is a good time to point out an important safety principle with canning. Always keep in mind that glass jars do not like to change temperature rapidly. If you take a glass jar out of boiling hot water and put it directly on a cold counter or table, the jar is likely to crack, break, or shatter. So put down a kitchen towel as insulation. If you fill a cold glass jar with boiling water, it will likely crack, break, or shatter. If you put a jar that's at room temperature into a pot of boiling water, it will likely crack, break, or shatter. See the pattern? It's the drastic change in temperature that causes the glass to break. So we want to change the temperature of the glass slowly and avoid drastic temperature differences. Keep that principle in mind throughout the canning process to help you avoid breaking jars. All right, Let's talk about how I can my tomatoes. You're going to need about 20 pounds of tomatoes to fill 7 quart-sized jars, but that amount could vary. You'll need 13 pounds roughly to fill 9 pint-sized jars. Don't worry if you don't have enough to run a full load in your canner. I found a way to work around that using placeholder jars, and I'll show you that in this video. So let's get started peeling the tomatoes. Fill a large pot halfway full of water and bring it to boil. And while that's heating up, cut the cores out of your tomatoes. I just use a sharp knife to make a rough wedge cut around where the stem attaches to the tomato. It doesn't have to be pretty, it doesn't have to be perfect, just get it done. I collect all of my cored tomatoes in a large bowl. I put all the cores in the compost. Those will help grow new tomatoes next year. Once the water is boiling, carefully put your tomatoes into the boiling water. Let them cook for about 3 minutes. While they're cooking, make a large ice bath. I like to stop up my sink and fill it to about 1/3 full with ice water. After you've cooked your tomatoes for 3 minutes, use a pair of tongs to pick them out of the boiling water and drop them into the ice bath and let them cool down for a couple of minutes. Now you can start peeling them. I like to save as much of the tomato juice as possible. It's good for topping off the jars, and you can also can the extra tomato juice too. It's the same thing as the canned tomato juice that you buy in the store, only it's better. To save the juice, I use a colander inside of a big bowl. I pick up each tomato one by one and I let the water drip off of it. And then I hold the tomato over the colander as I pull off of the peel. And the juice will sort of drip down off of it into the colander and down into the bowl. And then I plop the peeled tomato down into the colander as well, and it will continue to drip a little bit of juice as you go along. It's kind of amazing how much juice you can collect in a whole batch doing it this way. All of the peels that I pull off the tomatoes go in the compost, and those also go to help grow new tomatoes next year. After you've peeled all your tomatoes, it's time to fill your jars. Using a canning funnel, fill your jars with peeled tomatoes up to an inch below the very top of the rim. This is 1 inch of headspace. If you come up a little short, you can use some of the tomato juice you collected to make up the difference. Now add 1 teaspoon of non-iodized salt per quart jar, or 1/2 teaspoon per pint jar. You can leave out the salt if you want your tomatoes to be low sodium. However, you must add 2 tablespoons of lemon juice per quart-sized jar, or 1/2 tablespoon per pint jar, to make sure the tomatoes have enough acid to be properly preserved through the canning process. I also had enough tomato juice to fill a quart-sized jar, so I'm going to can that too. And I'll add the same amount of salt and lemon juice as I did for the tomatoes to my tomato juice. Once all the jars are full, carefully wipe the rim of each jar with a paper towel dampened by vinegar. Be sure there's no residue on the rims. Residue on the rims will keep the jars from sealing properly, which means the jars won't be shelf stable. Next, place a lid on each jar and then secure the lids in place with a ring for each. You don't have to over tighten the rings, just finger tight is plenty. And if you don't have enough tomatoes for a full batch in your canner, fill the remaining number of jars with simple water. And you can reuse an old lid for these water jars because it doesn't matter if they actually form a proper seal. These water jars are just in the canner to take up the extra space in the pressure canner, because you don't want the jars in there floating around as the water's boiling. That could potentially cause the glass in the canner to break. So since I only had 4 jars of tomatoes and 1 jar of tomato juice, I will add 2 jars of water into the batch just to fill up the space. Fill your pressure canner with 3 quarts of water and add 2 tablespoons of vinegar to avoid getting water spots on your jars. Now carefully add your jars to the pressure canner. Check the steam vent in the pressure canner lid to make sure that it's clear. You should be able to hold it up to a light and you should be able to see a pinhole of light coming through. And that means that it's clear and it will allow the steam to escape, which is very important. You want to be able to allow that steam escape. If for some reason the vent is clogged up, make sure you clear that out before you begin the canning process. Place the lid onto your pressure canner and lock it down into place. Turn the heat to high and wait for a steady stream of steam to start coming through the steam vent. Once steam starts coming through, you can turn the heat down a little bit to medium and let steam continue to vent for 10 minutes. Your pressure gauge should be reading 0 psi during this process. Then, after 10 minutes, place your 10 psi pressure regulator weight on top of the steam vent. It will take several minutes for the pressure gauge to slowly rise to 11 psi. Once there, the 10 psi pressure regulator weight will start to wobble and allow steam to escape the steam valve. And at this point, I found that I can turn the heat down to low, but make sure that it is enough heat to keep the pressure canner at least 11 psi. You need to cook your tomatoes for 10 minutes at 11 psi. And if at any point the pressure drops below 11 psi, you need to reset your timer. It must remain above 11 psi for a full 10 minutes. And once the tomatoes have cooked for 10 minutes, turn off the heat. Don't remove the weight yet. Allow the canner to cool down slowly until the pressure gauge reads 0 psi. And then, being careful not to be burned by a stream of steam, remove the pressure regulator weight from the steam valve and let the steam continue to naturally vent for another 10 minutes before you decide to open the canner. After 10 minutes, you can safely remove the lid from the canner and remove the jars from the canner and place them on the kitchen towel on top of your counter or table. Allow the jars to cool down for a full 24 hours before you move them. And you may start to hear the lids begin to ping or pop as the vacuum inside the jar sucks the lids down onto them. This is the vacuum seal that we were trying to create, and this is what makes sure that the jars are completely sealed and they will be shelf stable.
There's no such thing as a sterile man.
After 24 hours, check to make sure all the lids are properly sealed. The lids should now be slightly concaved inward toward the jar instead of domed up over the jar. Any jar that hasn't properly sealed must be refrigerated and used within 2 weeks. Unfortunately, one of my cans didn't seal properly in this batch. I think the jar was a little too full and some of the contents expanded out of the lid during the canning process and broke the seal. So be careful not to overfill your jars. You want to be sure to leave 1 inch of headspace and no more. But no worries, I can put this jar that didn't seal in the fridge and I'll use it within 2 weeks. I'll cook something that uses canned tomatoes. The final step in the process is to write the date and the contents of the jar on the lid with a Sharpie marker. This will give you an easy reference to know how old the contents of your jar are. When you store the jars, don't stack them on top of each other because this could damage the lids and break the seal. Always stack them in a single layer. And always check your jars before you use them to make sure they have maintained a proper seal. Tomatoes canned this way should be good for 18 months. Proverbs 6:6-11 says, "Take a lesson from the ants, you lazy bones. Learn from their ways and become wise. Though they have no prince or governor or ruler to make them work, they labor hard all summer, gathering food for the winter? But you lazy bones, how long will you sleep? When will you wake up? A little extra sleep, a little more slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and then poverty will pounce on you like a bandit. Scarcity will attack you like an armed robber. That's what the Word of God says. So be wise, work hard and work smart, be resourceful, be diligent, and get out there and grow and be fruitful.